And welcome to another edition of our treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled Biased Love, and it's for September the 6th, 2020, Fall Quarter Lesson Number 1. And it's taken from Genesis, the 37th chapter, verses 2 through 11, then verses 23 and 24, and then verse 28. Now, a little background information. Today's lesson is talking about Joseph and the story of Joseph. And we're going to be spending a little bit of time with Joseph and talking about his life history. And I want to, as our initial background information, to point out some points that C.I. Scofield pointed out in his reference Bible. It is true that nowhere in the Bible is there an assertion that Joseph is a type of Christ, but the similarities are amazing. First similarity, both were especially objects of a father's love. The second similarity, both were hated by their brethren. The third similarity, the superior claims of both were rejected by their brothers. The fourth similarity, the brothers of both conspired against them to slay them. The fifth similarity, Joseph was, in intent and figure, slain by his brethren, as was Christ. The sixth similarity, each became a blessing among the Gentiles and gained a Gentile bride. And the seventh similarity, as Joseph was reconciled to his brothers and afterward exalted them, so Christ will be reconciled with his Jewish brothers and exalt them. Okay? Now, starting off with our reading today, Genesis 37, 2 through verse 2. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending to the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and brought their father a bad report about them. So we see here where the seeds of hostility are beginning to be sown in this family. Now, we don't really know whether or not Joseph was being a whistleblower and telling his father something that he really should have told, or if he was just being a talebearer. But we know that the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, the handmaidens, had really taken a lot of offense to Joseph sharing that information. And also, too, just to note, there's a lot of times in the book of Genesis where this account of, or in the original Hebrew, Toledoth, which is a history, a narrative of lives and actions. This occurs a lot in the book of Genesis. Now, there it is true. Now, being a talebearer and a gossiper is condemned in the Bible. But there's also legitimate times where people need to share information. Uh, we find that happened a lot with Paul as he dealt with the churches. 1 Corinthians 1:11, my brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me there are quarrels among you. Then jumping up to 1 Corinthians 5:1, it is actually reported that there is sexually immorality among you, and of a kind that even pagans do not tolerate. A man is sleeping with his father's wife. Now, 1 Corinthians 11:18. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. So we see here how that Paul uh, was talking about this whistleblowing that was going on. And sometimes that is a very legitimate thing that goes on and should be done. Uh, those of us in the ministry, they are requirements that we have in the continental United States where we are required reporters of some things, like, for example, child abuse, child molestation. We are required to report those things. We cannot withhold that information. But the main thing, the main difference is the intent of sharing the information and who you share that information with. Now, if you see somebody stealing and you report that to the authorities or you report that to the people in charge, that is really not gossiping. That is being a whistleblower. If you see someone doing uh, something extremely unsafe, like if you see a school bus driver uh, flying down the road at 100 miles an hour, and you call the school board and say you got, bus number 37 is running 100 miles an hour down the road here, and it's got children in it, and those children's lives are in danger. That's not being a gossiper, that's being a whistleblower, and it's completely legitimate and exactly what you should do. Okay? But we do see how that Joseph's activities did start fueling the fire. Genesis 37 verses 33 and 4. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, we see from the book of Genesis where the children of Abraham, starting with Abraham, there was favoritism that was multi-generational that happened in this family. And it caused a lot of strife. We see how that Abraham had his favorite Isaac, and that had a lot of legitimacy to it because the promise was going to come through Isaac. And God had told Abraham that. But then Isaac, he had his favorite, which was Esau. And surprisingly enough, The promise was not going to come through Esau, yet Esau was Isaac's favorite anyway. And Jacob and his children carried that same situation forward of having a favorite child. Now, let me tell you something. We should not have favorite children and favorite grandchildren. That puts an undue burden on the child that we've made that's our favorite, and it also too instills jealousy and friction in the family. You need to treat your children equal and not have favorites. For one thing, it is a very godly thing to not have favorites. Deuteronomy 10:17 and 18. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigners residing among you, giving them food and clothing. Romans 2nd chapter 10 and 11. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first to the Jew, then for the Gentiles. For God does not show favoritism. Ephesians 6:8 and 9. Because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, there is no favoritism with him. It is extremely important for us to realize that that God has no favorites, and we should treat people equal. Everybody should be treated equal in the law of the land. Everyone should be treated equal in the way we rent our houses. Everybody should be treated equal when we go and we sit on a jury. Everyone should be treated equal. It's only by their actions that people should be judged by. Okay? Genesis 37:5 through 7. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Now there is one thing that is a reality when you read this story of Joseph and his brothers, and that is this was a true prophecy. God had given Joseph this vision. It was the word of the Lord that came to Joseph, and he was a true prophet of God. Now, that is a true statement. That is the absolute reality that cannot be disputed. But I don't know in my mind whether or not Joseph should have told his brothers. There's sometimes you may know something that you don't have liberty to share at that moment. And we should be wise enough to understand when those moments are. You know, the writer of Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes 5:2 and 3, do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your hearts to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. A dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool. They are sometimes we need to just smile and keep our mouth shut. Now, possibly, I don't know this for a fact, possibly that may have been the situation Joseph was in. I don't know. I do know there have been times in my life where I may have been technically correct, but I really should have kept my mouth shut. I didn't have liberty of the Lord to say anything. There are a ton of times on social media where I may have an opinion that I truly, deeply believe is valid, or I may have a piece of information that I know is true. But God doesn't give me the liberty to share it because it's saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. God has to give you the unction to say things sometimes. If you get the unction and God would have you to say it, by all means, please say it. If you don't, that blood will be on your hands. But if you don't get that unction to say it, keep your mouth shut. Okay, Genesis 37:8-10. My brothers said to his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? And we see here how that even Jacob began to see how that this was instilling jealousy, and how it seemed like his little 17-year-old son was getting kind of full of himself. Now keep in mind that Jacob had went through some similar things with the jealousy of Esau and him when Jacob had finagled his way around and gotten the birthright and got the blessing and everything. And also, when Jacob went to Haran and worked in Laban's fields, and suddenly the next thing he knew, Jacob had a lot more cattle than Laban and his boys had. And he seen how the jealousy had worked up there. And he was probably trying to get his boy Joseph to think through that. Genesis 37 and 11. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, like I said now, Jacob had been through some of this, and he had actually had a dream too about what God was going to do. So Jacob kept this in mind. Now, part of the story that is not part of our text is how that Jacob had sent Joseph down there to check on his sons who were keeping sheep out in the field. And his sons had decided they were going to kill him. And Reuben, who was the oldest boy, decided he was going to try to save Joseph. And so he told the boys that, hey, why don't we just put him in this cistern here? And actually, Reuben's plan was wait until they all calmed down and then go rescue Joseph. But it didn't work out that way. Genesis 37:23 and 24. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him in the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Now, there was no way Joseph was going to be able to get out of that cistern. And they decided they were going to tear that robe up, put blood on it, and that was going to be their excuse. They had, fortunately, listened to Reuben, where they wasn't going to kill Joseph, but they were going to sell him into slavery. And Reuben undoubtedly was off somewhere when a lot of these events took place, especially when they sold him into slavery. Now, 37 and 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now, like I said, Reuben was off somewhere working, and then they saw their opportunity to sell Joseph into slavery. Now, I don't know, and it's not super 100% clear whether or not the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are the same people. It could possibly be that it's talking in the Midianites were like slave traders, and the Ishmaelites were the people who actually were the first original purchaser of Joseph. But it doesn't really matter. It could also be that the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are the same group. But they were remote kin to Jacob's boys. But they sold their brother into slavery. Now, this broke poor Reuben's heart. He was terrified when he realized that his plan did not work. Now, a couple of concluding thoughts I want to leave you with. Um, First off, is that it's true that the brother's jealousy and the events of Joseph's life put him in a place to feed his family. So everything did work out to good. But let me point out another thing is that the famine, which was on its way, was the result of sin. So we need to be careful. It is true, Romans 8:28, but we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now that is true. God is working in our lives for our best interest to help us out. That is a true statement. But it's also a true statement that sin brought death and destruction in this world. John 8:44, you belong to your father the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So God loves you and works toward your good. That does not mean God wants the death and destruction in this world. See, sin brought that death and destruction, and God is working to see us through it. Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.